Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we are breaking down a really surprising theological argument from Healing Book Update 2024. Now, to keep things super focused, we're zeroing in entirely on the main points from Chapter 12. This specific chapter presents a massive paradigm shift in how believers approach divine healing. Why does this matter to you? Well, because it challenges centuries of traditional practice with a highly structured, scriptural argument. So, we're going to walk through exactly how the author lays out this case. Okay, let's dive into this. The text hooks the reader right away in Chapter 12 with a premise that feels kind of counterintuitive to how most of us understand religious practice. The author asks this wonderfully simple question: should we actually ask God to heal? And the text's answer is that if we look really closely at the New Testament, Jesus and the apostles literally never asked God to heal anyone. They didn't make requests. They operated in a totally different way. To support this, the text points directly to the actions of Jesus. Notice his words here: "I will be thou clean." When a leper approached him, Jesus didn't look up to heaven and ask the Father to heal the man. Instead, he issued an authoritative command. And the source provides multiple examples of this. Jesus commanding a withered hand to stretch forth, rebuking a fever, or telling a paralyzed man to get up and walk. It's always a direct spoken command. And the author points out that the apostles followed this exact same pattern. In the book of Acts, we see Paul and Peter addressing physical ailments and spirits head-on. Paul doesn't petition God to intervene, just listen to his direct command: "I command thee in the name of Jesus Christ to come out of her." They address the problem directly without asking God to do the heavy lifting for them. So, the crucial point is, why? Why did they operate this way? Well, according to the text, it all comes down to understanding the mechanics of divine authority. The source references Luke 9:1, noting that Jesus gave his disciples power and authority to cure diseases. He didn't instruct them to go out and ask God to heal the sick. He essentially deputized the church to minister in his stead. He specifically authorized them to just do it themselves. The author brilliantly illustrates this concept of authorization using a simple, everyday analogy: the difference between power and authority. Power is just the raw ability to do something, right? Think about a burglar. They have the physical power to break into your house, but they certainly don't have the right to do it. Authority, on the other hand, is the right to use power. A police officer with a warrant has both the power to enter the home and the official authority backing them up. The text argues that believers have been officially authorized by God, meaning they have the legal spiritual right to command healing. But the author doesn't just rely on the New Testament to build this case. The text argues that the Old Testament heavily foreshadowed this kind of delegated authority. We're shown several key historical precedents where individuals used delegated power rather than asking God to act. We see this with Esther and Mordecai, with Moses at the Red Sea, and with the prophet Ezekiel prophesying directly to the dry bones. Take the gripping story of Esther for a second. She and Mordecai needed to counteract a wicked, empire-wide decree. Now, the king didn't just write a new law for them to fix the problem. He handed them his ring and authorized them to write whatever they pleased in his name. The author points out that when that decree arrived, it was treated exactly as if the king himself had written it. The author argues that Jesus has done the exact same thing for believers. When an authorized believer issues a command in the name of Jesus, it carries the exact same weight as if Jesus were standing right there giving the command himself. But honestly, perhaps the most fascinating piece of evidence comes from Moses at the Red Sea. When the Israelites were trapped, Moses naturally cried out to God. But listen to God's surprising response in Exodus 14:15, "Wherefore criest thou unto me?" God actually questions why Moses is praying to him about the problem. Instead, God instructs Moses to use the rod he had already been given to stretch out his own hand and divide the sea. The source uses this to argue that God expects believers to exercise the authority they've already been handed rather than asking him to do what he already authorized them to do. Now, naturally, this brings up a pretty obvious counterargument, which the text tackles head-on. If we aren't supposed to ask God to heal, how does the author reconcile this with James chapter 5, which explicitly instructs the elders of the church to pray over the sick? It's a completely valid question regarding scriptural interpretation, and understanding the answer is absolutely key to grasping this whole paradigm. The source resolves this by redefining our strict, modern definition of prayer. The author argues that while to pray strictly means to ask, Jesus actually expanded this definition. For example, when teaching the disciples the Lord's Prayer, Jesus started with "Hallowed be thy name," which is pure praise, right? It's not a request for a favor. Therefore, the text argues that the prayer of faith mentioned in James encompasses an entire process, approaching God with praise and thanksgiving, and then issuing spoken commands directly to the sickness. Both actions coexist under the broader umbrella term of prayer. The text actually outlines very practical steps so you can understand what this looks like in action, which is why this matters so much for anyone studying these texts. Step 1. You pray to acknowledge God's greatness, His power, and the promises of the atonement. Step 2. You pivot. You exercise authority to speak directly to the sickness, commanding it to depart. The author points to examples in the book of Acts to back this up. When Peter healed Tabitha, the text notes he knelt down and prayed first, but then he turned to the body and gave a direct command. Tabitha, arise. The prayer to God and the command to the body are two distinct actions within the exact same event. This brings us to a really fascinating concept the text introduces to tie all this together, the Elisha principle. Before Elijah was taken up to heaven, Elisha watched him part the river Jordan by smiting the waters with his mantle. When it was Elisha's turn, he didn't reinvent the wheel. He simply copied his master's exact action, smiting the waters himself, and he got the exact same result. Mimicking the master leads to identical outcomes. The text ties this principle directly back to the New Testament mandate found in John 14:12, where Jesus states that believers will do the works that he did. The author's underlying belief is that Jesus came to teach the church by example. Just as Elisha copied Elijah, the modern believer is meant to copy Jesus. If Jesus and the apostles commanded healing rather than asking God for it, the text argues that believers today are meant to explicitly duplicate those exact methods to see the same results. Which leaves us with this final central question that completely summarizes the paradigm shift of chapter 12. Are believers meant to be passive petitioners, merely asking for intervention, or authorized ambassadors actively issuing commands on behalf of the king? It's a perspective that completely rewires how we read these ancient texts. Whether you agree with the theology or not, it certainly leaves us with a lot to ponder about power, authority, and interpretation. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep asking those deep questions.